Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and good evening. Welcome to another episode of The Review, the show where we take a closer look at issues in the news. Now, for the whole of November, we're dedicating the review to Islamophobia awareness. And tonight I'm going to be joined by a range of experts in their field to discuss the worrying subject of hate crime. Now, later in tonight's show, we're going to be hearing from a former far-right extremist to help us understand a little bit more about the pathways that can lead to extremism. Now, in a moment, I'll be introducing my first guest of the evening, but before that, please take a look at this short film.
In 2019 to 20, reports show more than 100,000 hate crimes were recorded by the police in England and Wales. A 2-year study of diversity by the Wolf Institute called How We Get Along has concluded that most people are tolerant of those from different ethnic backgrounds, but many have negative attitudes based on religion. The study, based on a survey of 11,700 adults in England and Wales, found that religion is a red line for many, especially when it came to Islam. Almost 3/4 of non-black or Asian respondents said they were comfortable with a close relative marrying a black or Asian person, but only 43% were comfortable with a close relative marrying a Muslim. The majority of Muslims were uncomfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying a non-Muslim. If religion is the final frontier of personal prejudice, what can we learn from the way other biases in the UK, such as race and class, have largely been resolved? We find out tonight on The Review.
Some extremely interesting points raised, and some of those points we're going to be talking about during the course of tonight's show. Well, it's time to introduce my first guest. If I could begin with Shaukat Adam. He is a volunteer and chair of the Leicester MEND working group and sits on the National MEND Advisory Panel. Now, he was involved in a very high-profile case when Zainab Hussain, a mother of Somalian descent, was mowed down by a far-right extremist in his car. Now, this was initially reported as a collision, despite the racist and Islamophobic motives that were evident from the onset. Shaukat, salam alaikum.
Assalamu rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you for joining us. I'm also joined by Amina Sharif. Amina is a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, no less, studying Islamophobia at the Faculty of Education. Assalamu alaikum, Amina.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Welcome to our show tonight. And I'm also joined in this first section by Faiza Muqeet. Now, she is a lawyer with expertise in pro bono and employment law. Now, she joined MEND and their Islamophobia response unit in 2019. She now provides assistance to victims of Islamophobic hate crime and discrimination. Excellent work there. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, Faiza.
Walaikum salam.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you guys for joining us. I don't know if you were able to hear the short film that we just played. Extremely worrying facts and statistics done in recent surveys. We're seeing that race is becoming less of an issue for people. Religion is becoming much more of an issue for people. But I'd like to start with tonight. We're focusing on the concept of particularly of hate crime tonight. And I'd like to, before we look at the interplay of Islamophobia and hate crime, beginning really with what we understand by the term hate crime. Perhaps, Faiza, if I could come to you with that one to begin with.
Yeah, so I can give you the Crown Prosecution Service definition of hate crime. So it's any criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by hostility or prejudice based on a person's disability or perceived disability, race or perceived race, or religion or perceived religion, or sexual orientation or perceived sexual orientation, or a person who is transgender or perceived to be transgender.
Right, so that's a very specific definition, and I noticed that one word that is repeated again and again and again throughout that terminology was perceived. Whether the offence or the threat or the initial complaint is perceived by the victim, and whether the person is perceived to be one of those minority groups. How important is that concept, Faiza, of perception when we're talking specifically about hate crime as opposed to other crimes?
It's very important because more often than not, people are categorized as being Muslim. And I can come on to the definition of Islamophobia generally later. But say, for example, a Sikh person who wears a turban and has a long beard can be a victim of Islamophobic hate crime because the perpetrator may well think that that person is a Muslim. So that person will be protected under this definition also. So it's really important that perception is included.
Absolutely. If I could come over to yourself, Amina, you're studying a PhD in Islamophobia. Is all Islamophobia hate crime? Are the two synonymous with one another, or is there a difference? Is there a threshold where Islamophobia becomes a hate crime?
Well, I think just to build on Faiza's definition, I can offer a sociological definition of hate crime. And I think it's incredibly important to not reduce Islamophobia to hate crime. And hate crime typically in our minds references the spectacular, the overt, the brutal assaults on our physical bodies. And it might also appear in the form of tweets on social media and in the form of bullying in schools. But if we define Islamophobia just by these spectacular forms of racial violence, then what we do is we erase the ways in which these forms of violence actually emerge from a social, an economic, a political, a geopolitical, a racial context. And so that is what we need to foreground in our discussion of Islamophobia, that it is not something that is just reserved to the very open and blatant, but it can take forms that are insidious and quiet and silent. And so some of the examples of these forms of Islamophobia might be in the way it expresses itself in employment. So we know that Muslims who present their CVs and who have a Muslim name are 3 times less likely to be offered an interview. Sorry, do you hear me fine?
Right.
Yes?
I'm aware of that research. And actually, I want to come on to that in a second, to all 3 of you. I want to come on to the sort of some examples of Islamophobia. But before we just move on to that, I want to come to Shaukat. How important is it what Faiza was saying there about those sort of thresholds and knowing that, we talk about Islamophobia, we talk about hate crime. In the work that you do with MEND, is it easy to differentiate between the two?
What Sister Faiza and Sister Amina have talked about is extremely important in terms of the fact there's a legal definition and there's a sociological aspects of it. I'm a layperson, I am a volunteer, and I work, I have a day job, alhamdulillah, and I have volunteered the last few years because I see the tangible that Sister Amina was talking about on the streets. I see it with the children, my own children, in fact, who go to schools. I see it with people who are in my community. It is extremely difficult sometimes to establish whether something is Islamophobic from a legal perspective. And we have been working extremely hard. It is silent and it affects people. And we've seen the reports, and I'm sure we'll go through it in a little while, about, you haven't got that PhD despite being such a wonderful and able and possibly the best candidate for it. So these are all little things that build up to what Islamophobia looks like on the street. It's not defined. You may not be able to touch it. My surname is Patel, and because of that surname and possibly because of the way I look, some people don't perceive me as Muslim. And people that I know that are in my confidence because of the job that I do don't know what faith I am. And these are good people, and yet they want to have a discussion about the Muslim problem. These are the little things that all build up to hate and Islamophobia, which are not defined. And as Faiza said, the thresholds are really, really difficult to establish sometimes, to establish whether something that is said, something that is done is in fact Islamophobic in the eyes of the law. And that is why it's very, very important that we have discussions like this to get the message out there.
Faiza, it's very hard, as we're hearing, to really define. You defined hate crime extremely specifically and precisely, but again, when it comes to where exactly Islamophobia becomes hate, as Amina was saying, that often it's very invisible. These are things that we can't see. They're sort of silent prejudice that's going on behind the scenes. Give us some examples from the work that you're doing at MEND that specifically tackle very clear instances of things that many of us would be dealing with on a day-to-day basis that we may not consider would cross the threshold into hate, but would be considered legally as hate.
So in terms of, I think the examples that you're probably referring to would lap into discrimination. So that's another area that I work on. So in terms of the cases that the Islamophobia Response Unit receives, it includes discrimination, religious discrimination in the workplace, goods and services. So say, for example, you go to the shop and you're not served because you have a niqab on, or getting on the bus, things like that. Lack of prayer room facilities and restrictions on Islamic clothing at work or in schools. Those are the types of instances that we're seeing, and it's those things that people deal with day in, day out. And I can give you one example of a case that I've been working on recently. It's of a sister who went to university, and because of discrimination by her lecturer, she left without her degree certificate. And now, for someone like myself, I've been born and raised in Britain, and you think that by going to university that you would be receiving the same level of services that everybody else would, and you don't realize the level of Islamophobia that's embedded in these structural institutions, which necessarily discriminate you. So this person left university without a degree certificate, and it impacted her entire career, like her entire life. And so this person came to us, and we've been representing her since the very beginning. And alhamdulillah, very recently, we got a good result. We got her a degree certificate and a settlement for her. So it's those things that, shockingly, you think it won't happen, but it does. And those are the things that we're seeing on ground. And since the opening of the IIU, we've received about 750 reports of religious hate crime, so Islamophobic discrimination, as well as Islamophobic hate crime.
Well, I'm going to come to that a little bit later about the rise in hate crime across the board. We'll be talking about that in our second segment. I want to come back to Amina. Amina, in your research, what are the sort of trends that you've been seeing, the data and the evidence about Islamophobia, and how Islamophobia then leads on to hate?
Well, that's an incredibly broad question, but thank you for giving me that opportunity to talk about my work. So very generally speaking, my PhD project explored the impact of Islamophobia on young Muslim women's sense of belonging. Right. And by young Muslim women, I refer to girls between the ages of 12 and 18. And I'm in the process of writing up my thesis at the moment, and I'm working on this concept of how Islamophobia creates a situation where a situation of siege, and I call this situation besiegement. And it really refers to this idea that when you have spectacular forms of racial violence that are directed towards Muslims, it doesn't just affect, immediate victims of this violence, but it also creates a culture, or it creates a sense of besiegement in people who identify and look like those who are victims. And so part of this feeling of besiegement is, feeling as though you are assailable, that you might be the next one who is going to be attacked on the street. You might be the next one who might be the next one that is sort of targeted by the security state. So, Islamophobia doesn't just affect those who experience it firsthand, but it affects the entire community. And so this is what makes it so incredibly important to tackle, because it has these sort of unseen ripples that reach far into our communities.
I mean, so. Again, your research is focusing on the impact on girls between, I think you said the age of 12 and 18. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
So for a percentage of those girls, it's going to be around the issue of hijab, how identifiable they are. Of course, not all Muslim girls wear hijab. Many don't wear hijab. But as you said, even those who don't, it's that perception. They feel like they're under attack because of the other racists, because of the other abuses that they've seen in the community. It impacts their sense of belonging, their sense of safety, their sense of, as you said, besiegement within the community. That's really interesting. I mean, that's something, Shaukat, that you've dealt with very, very specifically, haven't you? I mean, we talked about the case in our introduction of the Somali mother. This is somebody who, just on the basis of appearing to be Muslim, was mowed down in her car by a far right-wing extremist. Tell us a little bit about the case that you dealt with.
Yes, certainly. So, I mean, I remember it very vividly. A few years ago, it was a cold autumn evening, not dissimilar to tonight, where I got called to attend a mosque meeting because there was an incident that they felt that myself and my team at MEN could assist with. So I had just got into bed. I remember I had a long week. It was a Sunday evening, and they sent me a link. And what is very interesting about this link, it was from our local newspaper, and the link was to the incident they wanted to discuss. And the newspaper article described this incident as a collision. So I replied back saying, this is a car, this is a roadside traffic accident. What has that got to do with us? They were like, no, okay, you need to come. It's really important. So we made our way to the masjid where the mosque community brothers were there and sisters were there, and they laid out exactly what happened to Sister Zainab, who, like millions of parents or mothers or fathers around the country, was walking home after having dropped off her 2 school children. And as she was on the pavement, she saw a car, and she's described this to me vividly recently, approaching her. So, Allah protect us all from this situation. She's standing on the pavement, this car is coming towards her, hurtling towards her, and runs her over. She gets knocked down, but she manages to get up, and she thinks, oh my God, I've been in an accident. And she recalls, and she was in tears when she was telling me this, is that at that point, she heard those that were standing around her saying, oh my God, he's coming for you again.
Oh my God.
So this person was not only satisfied by running over her once, he had turned his car around and ran over her legs again. It was only through the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the fantastic work done by the emergency services. She was helicoptered to Nottingham, which is our city next door, airlifted there. Countless, I can't even remember now how many operations she went through. She was in hospital for close to 6 months. And this is a lady that was working. This was a lady who did charity work.
Shaukat, if I could come in there, that is the most horrendous example of an attack against an innocent person. What evidence do we have in that case that it was motivated by hate, that this was a hate crime?
What happened is we know that the individual who was arrested the very next day had confessed on the very day that he had done it, that he had done this because he had wanted to kill an expletive Muslim because of revenge for 7/7. And his exact words were to his stepbrother, which was transpired in court, that the country should be proud of what I have done. So the issue was that this was a horrendous attack on a sister. This was a horrendous attack on a human being. The perpetrator had confessed his motives to do this for no other reason but his hatred for the people of Islamic faith or Muslims. Yet our local newspaper was reporting it, and yet our local force, on their statement, had it as a roadside traffic accident.
So despite the obvious...
That is what Faiza and Stan are talking about, is Islamophobia and hate crime.
That's right. So despite that obvious connection, it was initially reported as an accident. Faiza, if I come back to you, and again, I want to drill down into this subject, into this specifically. Where does Islamophobia become a hate crime? Is there a threshold that we can define? Because the hate crime is so clearly defined in the law. But as we've all understood, and as you've all said so eloquently, it's a very grey area. The nuances around Islamophobia, the silent Islamophobia. How do we say this is now a hate crime?
There's a lot of difficulty on this topic because Muslims aren't identified as a race. And so whilst it's easy to identify racially aggravated hate crimes, and the reports for those are staggering, they're at like 72,000 in a year. It's and just comparing the statistics, there's 72,000 racially aggravated hate crime reports, whilst there's about 7,000 religious aggravated hate crime reports. So where Islamophobia fits in is it overlaps, and the legislation currently doesn't deal with the intersectionality of this issue, like the fact that a person may get mowed down by a car just by looking like they're Muslim, or having an Asian appearance, and so people may think that just by being Asian you're automatically Muslim. Do you see where I'm coming from? And so it's been a difficult run in that the police aren't reporting religiously aggravated hate crime and listing it under Islamophobia. And if what I'm trying to say is it's more easier to have a case prosecuted if there is a race element to it. So we've had cases where if a person is called a terrorist Muslim, the threshold is far harder to prosecute that person. Right. But if they're called a black terrorist Muslim, prosecution's far easier. Yeah. And that's what we're dealing with right now.
Yeah. Okay, well, look, that's a fascinating start to the show. Thank you all. Amina, I know that you're unable to stay with us, that you have a formal engagement, so thank you so much for joining us. Faiza and Shaukat, you will be staying with us. I want to come back in our next section and look at some of the increasing trends that we've seen, the rise in hate crime, and what sort of percentage of that is connected with religion as opposed to race, how much of it affects Muslims as opposed to other minority groups. Don't go anywhere, guys. We're going to be back soon. And don't forget, we're going to be joined shortly by a former far-right extremist to tell us a little bit about those pathways to extremism. We'll see you in about 5 minutes. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to The Review, where tonight we've been looking at the subject of hate crime. And I'm coming back to my guests. I am still joined by Faiza Muqeet and by Shaukat Adam, both from Men. Assalamu alaikum, guys. Thank you for staying with us.
Walaikum salam.
If I could come back to you, Shaukat, to start with. When we talk about hate crime in the UK, it was defined very clearly by Faiza in the first segment there. What sort of trends are we seeing in hate crime? Is all hate, we hear in the news that hate crime is going up. Is all hate crime going up? Are there some hate crimes that are going up more than others?
That's quite an interesting question. Religiously motivated hate crimes are certainly coming on the increase. I think Faiza will be able to give you more statistics and figures. But generically speaking, from 2017 and 2018, there were close to 8.5 religious hate crime incidents. That was in England and Wales, which was an increase from the previous year by 40%. And reported really motivated hate crimes. Previous section that not all hate crimes are recorded correctly. And in recent years, what's the most worrying thing about these religiously motivated hate crimes is that 52% of these attacks have been against Muslims. And when you consider that we're only close to 5% of the population,
I think we've just lost Shaukat. Sorry, we're going to come.
Attacks are against Muslims.
We're just going to come back to you, Shaukat. We're just struggling with your connection there. We're going to just try and shore that up. We'll come back to you in a second. Faiza, if I can just reflect on what some of Shaukat was saying, some of those figures are truly, truly worrying for our community.
Yeah, I can go over the most recent stats. So just since January 2019 to March 2020, we've seen about 72,000 racially aggravated hate crime reports, about 7,000 religious aggravated hate crime reports. And of that 7,000, almost 4,000 of those religious aggravated hate crime reports are against Muslims. So if you can just imagine, of all religions on one side, facing 50% of the religiously aggravated hate crime reports, and the Muslims taking the brunt of the other half. And that's shocking. And just as in since 2015, we've seen a 58% increase of religious hate crime reports. It can show the fact that police are taking the reports down correctly, and the rise of Islamophobia. It also shows a rise in Islamophobia as well. But I guess it also shows that people are reporting as well, which is a really crucial thing in this sense.
And is there any way of us knowing how much of that increase is due to an increase in awareness amongst the Muslim community, a willingness to report hate crimes or Islamophobic offences, or, as you also mentioned, the general awareness in society about Islamophobia and hate crime, and the fact that the police are, shall we say, in some cases more on the ball now when it comes to recognising what could be a hate crime? I know it's a difficult question. Is there any way of quantifying how much of that increase is one or the other?
I mean, it is very difficult, but the work that we do at the Islamophobia Response Unit, we're able to see those trends. One thing I should probably flag is that whenever there is disruption in the political sphere or some kind of event that's happened, for example, Brexit, we saw a massive spike. Coronavirus, the pandemic, since the lockdown, we've seen an increase in neighbour disputes. So we're able to tell that Islamophobes are now at home and they're harassing their Muslim neighbours. So we've seen a spike in those types of cases. So we can't really quantify exactly why the numbers are increasing, but we're able to see the spikes when certain events take place at least.
Yeah.
And the types of cases as well.
Right. And Shaukat, talking about the types of cases, have we seen any trends? Look, where Faiza mentions Brexit, she mentioned what happens in the media. How much of an impact does it have sort of directly on your work when somebody like the Prime Minister, or he wasn't the Prime Minister at the time, when somebody like Boris Johnson comes out and speaks about women, Muslim women, in what is perceived as a derogatory manner, talking about letterboxes and bank robbers? Do you see kind of an instant a reaction in the community, whether that be Brexit, whether that be Corona, whether that be the words of politicians? How long is that lag? How much of a response time is there between an incident and the effect that you see on the ground in our community?
Instantaneous. And the answer to your question is, and it's very interesting what you're talking about in that particular case regarding Boris Johnson, sisters who wish to wear the niqab. It is a minority in a minority in a minority in this case. And the scary thing is the police in my city, at least, when I sat on one of the police committee boards, were not recording it correctly. So when directly after Boris Johnson had made his letterbox and bank robbers comment, a sister was physically attacked and called a letterbox, and somebody children were actually pushing her around. And when I attended the meeting, it was recorded as a race crime rather than a religiously motivated and a blatant Islamophobic crime. And therefore, there is a lag between an actual crime and the actions being taken by the police on the ground. Now, sometimes that's because they're not aware of the definitions themselves and what to record what. But thankfully, with the work that has been done by MEND and the Islamophobia Response Unit and our research team, there is a greater awareness now within the police force to record it correctly. And unfortunately, or fortunately, because more people are reporting it, we're seeing a direct increase in numbers.
And Shaukat, just continuing on that point, are there sentencing implications? So if a crime is recorded as, say, an assault, but that same crime is now recorded as a racial assault or a religiously motivated assault, is there an implication when that person stands before a judge on the way that the CPS deal with it, or on the way that the judges will be able to sentence that crime?
Again, Faiza would probably be the best person to answer this. But from my experience, I've always found that when it's a race crime, the implications are much higher because of the protection that is afforded to people of race in this country as opposed to religion. So any form of race crimes, I have found its sentence is much higher and increase. What I have found in my experience in Leicester, and again, it may be across the country and it may be the correct thing to do, but I think research certainly needs to be done on this, is that the 2 or 3 cases that have been dealt with in the last month or so, the calls that we have got, the police have rushed for a community resolution. They want to resolve it as quickly as possible. Let's go for a community resolution. Don't want to press charges. Unfortunately, we get a lot of the victims telling us, the police are telling us this, that they don't really think we'll succeed. Let's not go to the Crown Prosecution Service. Let's go for a community resolution and let's get it over and done with. I know they're overworked. I know they're overburdened. Comments by the Prime Minister of this country and those in power doesn't help. But there is certainly an immediate rise. And unfortunately, they're just not equipped and they just don't have the manpower to deal with it adequately. So inshallah, in the future, other people will be deterred from doing the same thing again.
Faiza, you were nodding there during what Shaukat was saying. What are your thoughts on specifically on those points, on the points of how the crimes are recorded and the implications of that in terms of sentencing? And what can we do? What can we do as a community to, in many cases we're the victims of this. How do we focus our attention to make sure that the cases are being reported properly and that people, once they're reported, that people are being held to account, whether they're the authorities or the perpetrators?
I just encourage everyone to report it, even if you think that nothing's going to be done. It's really important that when we collate the data, when the police collate the data, it's that data that informs legislation, and it's that data that will change.
Excuse me.
So it's really important for people to report it. And in terms of what we can do is get involved with, volunteering the way Shaukat does for MEND. Speak about it. I think that's a really crucial point to make, where if we are speaking about it in different forums, for example, whether it's at work or at school or wherever it may be, finding a platform to talk about it more will hopefully inform some change.
It's a shame that we've lost Amina, our guest earlier, whose PhD specifically focused on 12-year-old to 18-year-old girls of a Muslim faith. But if I could come to you, Shaukat, Faiza just mentioned about schools. Have we seen an increase in the school system of children being victims? And who's paying attention? Is the school system aware of this? Does the data support the fact that there has been an increase in Islamophobic and hate crimes within the school system?
There certainly has been. Childline themselves recorded a 69% increase in racist bullying in the playgrounds. This was after the Manchester Arena bombings, with the most common terms being used as bomber and terrorists. So you can guess which children of which faith are being addressed for that thing. So that's a nearly 70% increase in children bullying. There's evidence by National Children's Services of children using caustic skin whitening cream because of the amount of racist bullying that they're getting. In my city, in Leicester, we get calls from parents and children who have been abused and bullied in the playground and been called those things that our Childline have found, which is a terrorist, you're just a terrorist, you're just bombers, you're extremists, etc., etc., especially during the election time where the rhetoric was really ramped up to appease those voters which may have deserted certain parties if they hadn't taken such an extreme view. And it's our children that are going to bear the brunt of this. And unfortunately, that is one of the reasons why I volunteer, because this is my home. This is more or less the country that I know. I grew up here, but my children really don't know any other country at all. And if I wish them to see no contradiction between being British and Muslim, we really do need to start doing something today in order for them to live in this country as practicing Muslims.
Well, you talk about that, wanting your children to have that sense that there is no contradiction. Certainly that's how I feel, and that's how I want my children to feel, that there is no contradiction between our Muslim values and British values. Faiza, when we see the rise of the right, and now, we're going to be talking in our next segment with somebody who was a former far-right extremist. He was a leader of a skinhead motorbike gang, and he's going to be talking to us a little bit now about the pathways to that. So that sort of far-right extremism is one thing, but when we see that sort of right-wing rhetoric creeping into mainstream politics, how much of an impact does that have on school children, kids in the street, our brothers and sisters in the workplace?
It definitely has an impact, and we're seeing it on the ground just by the cases that are reported to us. And just as much as it's impacting people and people are reporting it, I also feel like there's almost like a groundswell, like people aren't, they're not sitting idle, they are talking about it, and hence why it just feels like, in terms of what's happening in the political sphere, it's very, what's the word? It doesn't corroborate with what's happening on ground, because people are speaking about it, and I think more often than not people call it out for what it is. But just on the issue with schools, and this is some of the work that MEN does as well. We do go into schools and we do offer training, and I think that's really important, especially with things like unconscious bias training and things like that, which we actually offered to a case of ours recently of one of our youngest victim of Islamophobic discrimination and hate crime. Was a 4-year-old boy, and he was being bullied by a 4-year-old girl who, whilst hitting him, was saying Muslims are bad. And so you just ask the question, like, firstly, where on earth did that girl get that from? And secondly, how do we speak to our children? How do we tell our children, So that child came home and said to his mum, am I Muslim? And why am I bad? Do you know what I mean? So it is happening, and it's happening to age groups. Like our youngest victim is a 4-year-old. Our eldest victim is a 65-year-old. Like, the spectrum is so wide. So we know it's happening. Yeah. But I feel like people are talking about it, and there is always more to be done about it.
There is indeed. And I want to bring that back to Shaukat as we bring this segment towards an end. Shaukat, practically, what can we do as a community? Look, number one, we need to make sure that, we're not part of the problem. We need to be part of the solution. How do we do that as a community? How do we fight against hate? How do we make sure that the plight of Muslims in the community is being heard? Where do we turn if we think that we are the victims of something that's been happening to us or our family that could be Islamophobic or even reach the threshold of being a hate crime?
We certainly have to take this upon ourselves. We have to be proactive. We really have to take the reins and take responsibility. So that starts from the schools. That starts from home, from educating our children and our families. This comes from our masajids, from our members, from our ulama, talking about this to the congregation, that we shouldn't be tolerant of any forms of Islamophobia. We must know what our rights are, to engage with the wider community, to engage with the media, which we haven't spoken about today, but I know you had a show on last week, which is one of the major causes of Islamophobia, with the rhetoric and the bias reporting that goes on there, making people's minds up about Muslim community. We have to engage with our politicians. We have to engage with those that make legislation before it becomes law. Not after it becomes law, so therefore afterwards we become, this is happening to the Muslim community. We have to be there at the lawmaking stage. So become part of the political process, engage with the politicians, engage with our media. And whatever happens, we report it and we stand up to it. I think it was a few years ago when Baroness Warsi said that Islamophobia passed the dinner table test. Yeah. And unfortunately, it still is the case. You talk about the weather, talk about the football, and talk about the problem with Muslims. That shouldn't be tolerated, just like we wouldn't tolerate racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism. If any of our friends that are Muslims or non-Muslims, we hear anything Islamophobic, we bring it up straight away and we question them and say this is just not right. So we have to be engaged.
Thank you very much, Shaukat. Faiza, we're going to be going to a break. Faiza Muqeet and Shaukat Adam, both from Men, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your hard work at being there at the very vanguard of fighting Islamophobia and hate crime in general. We wish you all the best with your work. We are going to be going now to a break. Now, when we come back, we are going to be hearing directly from the former president of a skinhead gang. Don't go away. Moonshot and the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, amongst others. His primary research interests include right-wing extremism and terrorism, preventing and countering violent extremism, and very importantly, the roles that former extremists can play in countering extremism. Brad, thank you very much for joining us. We're very pleased to have you with us.
Yes, thanks for having me in.
Thank you. My other guests tonight, we have Hadia Masih. She is an expert consultant in the area of community cohesion, interfaith relations, and counter-extremism, with a particular focus on women's involvement in extremism and radicalization. Her experience spans over 22 years. She has been a counter-extremism consultant for various governments and NGOs worldwide. She's featured in Time magazine, The Independent, The Guardian, The New Statesman, the BBC News, and many, many others to mention. Thank you very much. Very nice to have you with us, Hadia.
Thank you for having me.
And Dr. Mariam Mahmood, thank you very much for joining us. She's from the Edward Cadbury Centre for the Public Understanding of Religion at the University of Birmingham. Now, her previous research was focused on the responses to religious and racial stigmatization and prejudice against Muslims in contemporary England and Jews in Weimar, Germany, respectively. Thank you very much, Dr. Mariam.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to start, if I may, with you, Brad. We've seen a rise in the right in recent years, whether that's within Europe, whether that's here within the UK, whether it's in the United States. We've seen this rise. What is fueling this rise? Where is it coming from? How come it's something that, wasn't such an issue 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, but we're seeing it in all of these different places around the world, and it's becoming more and more creeping. We're seeing it creeping into mainstream politics. What is behind this, Brad?
Great question. I think where I can start with that one is that I think these movements were there and have been there for decades, and it's, I think, the rising prominence of this. I don't want to blame the internet, but I think the internet has played a central role in allowing these movements to connect with each other internationally. Perhaps before these movements were more of a local phenomenon where they would be popping up in different cities around, and the internet, obviously, we know how it works. You can communicate internationally with this, and particularly with the far right. They've taken advantage of every single platform that they could possibly get themselves on, whether it be apps to social media to just websites. Anything they can do to platform themselves has been a central theme on the internet, and of course causing division and fear in communities. So going out and doing the real world protests, as we've seen across the United States surrounding the recent election, as we've seen in the UK surrounding a lot of the different political dissent that's going on, maybe surrounding the pandemic, maybe surrounding politics as well. These groups will take any and all platforms and any chance to insert themselves into often things that start out as could be a real grievance, but these guys end up showing up there and creating it. Choosing to use these types of platforms to push themselves, and even if they get kicked off, here's the main thing from my lived experience that I like to note is that any kind of attention for these groups is what they like. Yeah. Negative, positive, doesn't matter. Yeah. So that brings up the point of what do we do to not give them this platform?
Well, I want to come back actually and talk about one of those points a little bit later. The idea of hijacking local issues and turning them into getting that publicity for their beliefs. If I can come to you, Hadia. Look, 22 years you've been working in community cohesion. I mean, are these times to feel positive, negative? I mean, how do we feel? I mean, I've seen an enormous move forward since 9/11 in communities reaching out and talking to each other, in interfaith dialogue, in interfaith groups, and yet at the same time, we see this inexorable rise of the right. Should we be feeling optimistic, or is it really as bad as it can look sometimes?
Well, there's both sides, I guess. According to the 9/11 conference webinar we had, Brad was engaged in that and was a speaker on there, and he was saying that the terrorist kind of acts were things that fuel the far right, so they fuel each other. And this is what's happening, that, whatever's happening in the world with the terrorism issues, that gives food for the far right. And the far right give food to the terrorists as well. And that's like this vicious cycle. How do you break this cycle is something that we're really interested in with my work at Groundswell Project, is looking at hyper-local community organizations who are often targeted by extreme groups, whether that's terror groups, religious terror groups, or right-wing groups. How can we enable them and equip them to challenge hate effectively? Because they're the ones that are always being targeted. So they're the ones that need this help. And they're the ones that are often directly connected to the communities as well, to young people, so they can give positive messaging out there. So this is our idea of equipping local community organizations with the ability to come together and connect through interfaith, through cross-cultural dialogue. And that's how you dispel myths, and that's how you can act as a force field against any type of hatred that wants to penetrate a community. And so that's where there is negative, but the positive I've seen during COVID, you have, Jewish organizations helping Islamic organizations, Christian organizations, all of them coming together with food banks, helping each other. So there's a nice spirit of kindness and goodness that's coming out of this at the same time. And that's what we want to promote. That's what we want to focus on, because at the end of the day, the way to challenge hate is to push love. And the opposite of hate is love. And as cheesy as that must sound, it is something we have to effectively and strategically do. As Brad knows, as I know, extreme groups are strategic, and the ones that are promoting good and positive things aren't as strategic. So we need to get them to that stage and push out this positive, and that's how we can challenge it effectively.
I think that's really interesting you talk about that. And if I could bring that over to Dr. Mariam, I mean, your thesis explored anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. When we talk about groups coming together, as Hadia just mentioned, we've seen in the lockdown Muslim groups and Jewish groups working together. How much of the experience is shared when it comes to being on the receiving end of hate? How much can the two communities learn from one another? And really, I think we're learning at the moment, suddenly in the modern context, we're learning perhaps from the Jewish experience. How important is that correlation between the two communities?
It's exceptionally important. I feel like when we talk about anti-Semitism and when we talk about Islamophobia, they are both two sides of the same coin. That's not to say that they're the same, but rather that the ways in which they manifest are incredibly interlinked. So, for instance, the rise of far-right extremism correlates with, both rise in anti-Semitism, so anti-Jewish hatred, as well as anti-Muslim hatred, Islamophobia. Now, in terms of learning from each other, that's a really important question as well, because obviously both communities have been scapegoated in various different time periods. They've also experienced so much in terms of parallel, whether, the conspiracies that we see regarding Muslims and Jews, albeit differently. Jews are considered often by far-right rhetoric to be far too assimilated and trying to take over, whereas in regards to Muslims, it's more like conspiring to dominate by being insular and more ghettoized. So these are the sort of discriminations that they face. In terms of learning from one another, I'll give you examples, because I feel that it's only through learning side by side and interfaith that they can really make a difference. Dialogue is one thing, but I'll give you an example. So where I work at the Edward Cadbury Centre for the Public Understanding of Religion at the University of Birmingham, we believe in equipping faith leaders with the skills and tools required to enhance this sort of, the putting faith at the center of all engagement. So we have launched recently a master's in public administration, which is based in faith-based leadership. So it's the first of its kind, and it's really about bringing faith leaders, young and old, together to learn from each other, learn from, aspects of other people's sort of lived realities. So it's not just, preaching to a choir, because essentially that often is what happens with interfaith dialogue. You get the same people together in the same room discussing the same old things, and it's like, okay, so what tangible outputs and outcomes can we achieve? Yeah. So that's something that we're working towards, and it's incredibly beneficial for society as a whole.
And that's really important. You talk about preaching to the converted, and I'd like to bring Brad in here. Brad, you're somebody who has an understanding of the traps, of the pathways to this sort of racist extremism. And we talk about the similarity of the Jewish experience and the Muslim experience. And I know that the far right now, every bit as much as they have this anti-Semitic belief, they have beliefs that are focusing anti-Islamic beliefs. What is it that we can learn? What do we need to be doing to prevent the first steps towards this sort of hatred, towards this sort of racism that we see in these growing far-right groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very important. I think one of the places to start is the far right always looks at basic black and white thought processes. So, I mean, particularly in Canada, we've seen a massive rise in hate crimes over the last few years over here, and particularly targeting South Asian Muslims. And things and groups like this, and this is, I mean, this is the sentiment that they feed off of, right? So we see like large increases of violence against these certain populations because target groups, when there's this mystification that they try to do of like, oh, look at these groups that are coming in from, and they're trying to take away something from our culture or replace us with their culture, right? And that's what these groups will feed. And what we need to do is be on the other side and working as a greater community to unite the communities that surround, to say, look, that's their rhetoric, that's their narrative. We're not going to deal with this type of extremist narrative. We're going to be together and unite because of what we're seeing. And I think systemically we need to do a lot better too, because there's a lot of populations, particularly Muslim populations, and I know this in Canada, like there's a problem with reporting. People don't feel comfortable with going and reporting because the belief is, where's this report going to go? Is anything really going to happen when I make a report about different things that are happening? And it's, I think we again as a community need to work together to make safe spaces for all people. And I think that's what these groups are doing, is trying to, just as much as we want to unify and come together, they want to divide, right? So we have to answer to their division with our unification and with positive messaging. I know Hadia has worked on this too, like the counter narratives. How do we counter these groups? Well, yeah, we need to come again, as cheesy as it sounds, with love and respect and voices of unity. That will take the places of these. These different groups that are wanting to spout this rhetoric to divide us and instill fear in communities.
I mean, that's interesting. And Hadia, you've done work looking at people on both sides of the sort of Israeli and Palestinian issue. How practical is it? You imagine that these are almost intractable solutions, that the two sides are so divided. But when it comes to communicating, if you bring people together, if you're able to get people to engage in that dialogue, have you seen effective change? Have you seen people who were able to put aside whatever prejudices had, however many generations potentially they'd held it for, and see through that once dialogue and the channels of dialogue are made easy?
Absolutely, and that's why I want to emphasize the fact that dialogue is key. Sorry, I can hear my voice
Sorry, I know that can be very distracting. I would just try that again. I'm just going to speak to my producer. I think they're fiddling. The technical bods are doing all of their rushing around, fiddling and getting everything right. If you could try that again, Hadia.
I'm trying to find out where it was.
I was just asking you about how effective it can be when we open the channels of communication between people who have been divided, who have been unable to that point to see that there is a similarity or that we can work together. Once you open those channels of communication, how effective can that be at fighting discrimination and hatred?
Yeah, I was saying that is the only way that you can actually effectively challenge hatred is by pushing the idea of dialogue. Because if you have two people that do not understand one another and have got misconceptions, the only way you can dispel those myths is actually by bringing them together, getting them to talk about each other, and then realizing, oh my God, we're actually really, really similar. We're actually quite the same. And then you can go into your life realizing that you've actually made a friend. And I've seen this. I work extensively in interfaith as well. I worked with a very well-renowned Palestinian-Israeli peace group called the Bereaved Families Forum. And this was where Palestinians had lost their loved ones, Israelis had lost their loved ones, and they just thought enough is enough. We've had enough of the people who want to divide. We're here to stop this cycle and realize that we're, enough to about the conflict and about death, how many more people are going to die. I really recommend you go look into the Bereaved Families Forum based in Israel and Palestine. But even here, it's in England, we have an organization called Nisa Nashim working in Jewish and Muslim dialogue. So many organizations working within this space to try and dispel myths and come to like a good conclusion and have that effective impact that's lasting and that will fit in generations to come. Because if we don't change, then our next generation won't change. So we have to, it's part of our duty. It's not even something that we have a choice about. We have to bring people together, discuss our differences in a very civil manner, come out of our silos and discuss some difficult issues. So this is what, as an answer to your question in that sense is dialogue helpful? Of course, it's the only solution. And have I seen positive effects? Absolutely, I have. I myself had various misconceptions about Jewish people and Israel and all of these things. And it's only after I discussed them was I able to really understand how close I was to, the Jewish community. Even from faith perspective, we have very similar understanding of our idea of God. And as a result, I've done a lot of work with an organization called Muju as well, Muslim and Jewish Theatre. It just go on and on. But yeah, definitely I encourage people to go out and seek, areas where they can have dialogue in these organizations that I mentioned.
Well, I mean, talking about that dialogue of learning from, the common experience. If I can come to you again, Dr. Mariam, how much can we learn from history? Because when we see the rise of the far right now, are we just seeing again what we saw in Germany? Are we seeing the same tactics used? Are we seeing the same rhetoric? Are we seeing the same iconography when it comes to trying to build up hatred, trying to build up resentment, trying to build up a sense of us and them? And what can we learn from the German experience when it comes to fighting this sort of extremism today?
Right. That's a very important question. And just to add a caveat to that, it's that prejudice, discrimination, and hatred of all sorts isn't something that just pops up out of the blue. It lies latent throughout history. So, and comes up in blips. So you've seen what happened, obviously, as you refer to the Holocaust and the targeting of Jewish people in Germany in the Weimar era and then post that. But obviously, it wasn't just something happened then and then now we have an explosion of Islamophobia. We need to remember that this is an ongoing phenomenon. So, all throughout the 90s even, we've had the Rwandan genocide, we've had the Bosnian genocide. This isn't something that's, unique or new in that sense. It's it's recurring. And something that you can see alongside a pattern is that there is times of immense chaos, economic downturn, and social upheaval that accompany all of this, which causes a rise in populist narratives to take hold. So yes, that is something that is quite similar, and we can see those parallels throughout history, and not just two eras of history. Now, in terms of learning from the past, of course, there's an awful lot we can learn throughout. But just to add to that, I think one way of learning and implementing, all of that is it starts at a very young age. Yeah. So I agree that with the co-panelists in terms of dialogue. So I feel and I believe truly that we need a re-education. Especially in Britain today, we have the PSHE curriculum, and through that, I feel much like students and young people and children are told about the dangers of bullying and grooming. Similarly, they should learn about not just racism, but Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. So I work with, I'm a trustee for the Women's Interfaith Network, and what they do is they go into schools and they teach through visual medium, so short stories, and I'd really highly recommend that people check that out. And also when it comes to older generation, so some of our viewers might be aware of the Faith and Belief Forum. I've been working with them for well over a decade. There's young leadership programs that younger people then work alongside people from other faiths and none to develop action projects and community social engagement projects. And they're also mentored by people in Parliament. So I'm actually an alum of that program, and now I'm a mentor on that program. So that's how it works. It is this dedication and commitment to constantly educating oneself and one's community for the betterment of society as a whole. So I feel a lot can be learned, but it's up to us to actually be willing to not only learn, but implement in order to foster harmony and instill change.
That's fascinating, and I'm particularly interested in what you spoke about when you mentioned, that we're taught so much in the schools and as young people often about race, but this idea of, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism isn't so prevalent. And the Guardian newspaper recently had a report saying that religious intolerance is now a much greater cause of prejudice than race, and very shocking statistics about how people are much more comfortable if they're talking about marriage within their family of cross-racial marriage than they would be with cross-religious marriage. And we can come back and talk about that after the break. We are going to go to a break, and when we do come back from the break, Brad, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, and it's something you touched on earlier, when there are issues in a community that aren't perhaps dealt with as effectively as they should be, whether it's on a political basis, on a legal basis, does that leave a vacuum for extremism and for right-wing extremism? Guys, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to go to a short break now, and we'll see you just after this. Final segment in tonight's review, and tonight we are talking about hate crimes. Looking at some of the reasons behind it. I'm still joined by my guests, Brad Galloway, Hadia Masih, and Dr. Mariam Mahmood. Thank you guys for staying with us. I'd like to come back to you, Brad, if we can. Just before the break, we were talking really across all the co-panelists about the importance of dialogue. What I'd like to know from you, you're somebody who formerly had fallen into the for want of a better word, the trap of extremist beliefs, of far-right propaganda and rhetoric. How important was dialogue for you in your journey away from that sort of extremist thinking and towards what you're doing now, which is now building bridges between communities? What was the moment? What was that Damascenian moment for you?
Great question. I think perhaps there wasn't one exact moment where it was dialogue that played a role. It was over time. It was a lot of different incidents where I can remember, building back relationships with family members after leaving these groups, particularly, my wife and my kids, and learning about empathy and learning about humanization again. That was a key point in the dialogue. and some people from outside in the community that I would end up meeting. Also, when I began, working on a degree a number of years ago, I became involved with some different people that I never ever would have been involved with before in my life, and the different perspectives from those actual people, and also I did a lot of reading about all these things that I supposedly at one time judged or hated. I started reading about the different religions and different histories. I've always been a fan of history, so I started reading a lot of history about different cultures and things, particularly in Canada, because that's just I thought that was super helpful. But where I think dialogue is really important right now is opening these tough conversations that we wouldn't necessarily have had before. I mean, I myself and a colleague recently did a presentation about our time in the movement at a synagogue with the Jewish community, and having that dialogue and opening that door for their questions about why people would get involved in this. Why would we hate members of our own community just based on their religion, particularly Jewish people? And similarly, I've done work with members of the Muslim community in Canada, and it's the same thing. Opening the dialogue and talking about the tough things, or educating for lack of anything else, is so important, and that we have to learn about each other. I mean, if we don't know about each other and ask these particularly interesting questions that we have, we do end up with black and white thought. Oh, look at that. That is this way because of this. And we want to be careful that we don't end up in those echo chambers of just judgment and not understanding who these people are. So we want to make sure that we can get together and have these conversations. And that's what I think organizations like Hadia's, and this sort of works right into a good segue here for Hadia, but it's that's how we do this stuff on the ground, and that's how we get these things going and building communities back from these particular echo chambers that exist, right?
It's very interesting there that you. I think I'd like to use the word, if such a term exists. We know the term subconscious bias, but I think subconscious unbiased. You let something go there, which was fantastic. You referred to the Jewish people in our community. You referred to them as your community, as opposed to that. Them and us, because they're Jewish or because they're Muslim, they're not my community. They're part of another community. So I thought that was very telling. Thank you for that. Hadia, half of all children arrested in the UK last year under terrorist offences were right-wing groups. I mean, that's staggering. People are not aware. I mean, Islamophobia and Islam is always targeted as the terror threat. But actually, the police reports show that half of under 18s arrested last year were from right-wing organisations. How do we reach the youth? How do we reach young people? Because they're the ones who are being targeted online. They're the ones who are finding their way through the world. They're the ones who are easily susceptible to the kind of propaganda that just picks out another group of people and blames everything on them.
Yeah, absolutely. We did a really powerful webinar during Hate Crime Awareness Week. I think it's last week now. And it tackled exactly those issues. You were talking about online hatred. This is like a phenomenon now. Obviously, during COVID, there's everyone is completely living online, and so extremist groups from all walks of life, all the nasties, they come and promote their messaging online to young and vulnerable individuals who are feeling disenfranchised, who've got maybe mental health issues, all sorts of maybe vulnerabilities that are being taken advantage of online. And then you have it. You have young English white disenfranchised young guys being lured into these groups. You have religious extremists being lured into their groups. And it seems quite a mess. So I do encourage you to watch the webinar where we had actually Facebook, the head of dangerous organizations and counterterrorism, come and talk to community organizations. So you've got a big tech company coming down to talk to community organisation to say, this is how you report hate crime online. This is how we're going to do it. Because what's going to happen is they're not going to stop doing this work. They're not going to stop with their rhetoric and their hate online. But what we can do is equip our young people with the ability to challenge it, or the ability to recognize it, or the ability to become immune to it. So when they see it, they know that that is fake news, that this is not something I need to listen to. So we as a community, as a society, have a responsibility to educate our young people. And the project that I'm working in is trying to bring those with knowledge and understanding of how extreme groups work to then filter that knowledge into community groups who are being targeted. So that's like a solution for us. And then I really want to encourage people, if they see young people going down a certain route or speaking, should report this. There's a new app that is out there. I don't have the details, but there's an app where you can report extremist content or extremist activity online. If you have concerns about your loved ones that are going down this route, because anyone can go down it.
Yeah.
And if you are being targeted by extreme groups or hate crime, if you're a victim of hate crime, you must report it through True Vision. In the UK, you can report this stuff online. It's very easy. If people are not reporting Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, it's not happening according to the statistics. So we have to report it. And then finally, I just want to say, a lot of people think that what me and Brad do sometimes is a little bit wishful thinking, or we're naive. We're not. We've been through experiences. And what we're interested in is bringing those people who want to make a change, because those who don't want to make a change, leave them to it. Those who do want to make a change, we can create a groundswell of positive voices and then, spread that in a way that extreme groups want to spread their rhetoric. We can spread ours effectively.
Thank you very much for that. I want to come back to the point with you, Dr. Mariam. When we look at religious groups, how susceptible are people of no religion in this? When it comes to young people who have no religious background at all, are they understanding of the religious perspective in terms of being discriminated against because of religion? Are they more or less susceptible to being drawn into extremist views?
People of no religion can be drawn into extremist views. Yes, so when it comes to hatred and discrimination or prejudice of any kind, we need to remember that a lot of it has to do with being rather ignorant regarding other people. And this us versus them mentality, or a self versus other, is only harnessed and exacerbated based on ignorance. So when somebody sees someone else, they have certain preconceived notions or perceptions of the other. And what's really, really important and fascinating to note is that, yes, of course, you see that happening within people of faith, but also likewise people who don't belong to a specific faith group or belief. An ideology is there. So the hatred is all to do with power and control. So somebody who is susceptible to becoming an extremist or a radical, it's not necessary that faith is the problem, because that's essentializing or exceptionalizing faith. The issue here is lack of awareness, lack of education, and also this vulnerability that extremists then prey on. So a young person, for instance, from any community can be an easy prey or vulnerable to becoming an extremist. So it's not one's more likely than the other. What's necessary is this breeding ground where the person in question is vulnerable, most likely lack of awareness or education regarding the people who are being targeted. So that's often what happens. So you can see that happening even with far-right extremism. It's not necessary that all of it is based on Christian nationalism that we see in the US, for instance. That's a very extreme case, but often it doesn't have to be that way. Or even, for instance, when it comes to Hindu nationalism in India, of course, that again is a specific kind of hatred and extreme radicalization against a perceived Muslim enemy.
Yeah.
So here what happens is that the target group is racialized. So even if it is a religious minority that is being targeted, what happens is certain aspects or certain markers are affixed to that identity, so that it's not that just because I'm a Muslim, I'll be targeted for Islamophobia, but it's that those people are perceiving me as Muslim, and that's why somebody who's of the Sikh faith and wearing a turban can also be equally targeted for Islamophobia. So that's kind of how it works. It's not necessary to have a specific ideology or specific set of practices, but actually that power dynamic between the person who is grooming the potential radical.
And that's such an important point, and we actually spoke about that in our first segment, about that. It's often that perception of the other, whether that's correct or incorrect often. Brad, look, just coming up to some final words from each of you. How do we respond to hate? If we see somebody and we see that there's somebody, they're going off down the wrong path, how do we enter into that? Because they don't want to listen. As my mother used to say to me, there are none so deaf as those who will not listen. How do you engage in that dialogue and respond to that initial hate when you see it? You're somebody who's been through it. You've been in one side, you've come out the other side. You know, are there any gems? Are there any words of advice that you can give us that we can take away tonight? Well, if we see these things happening in our community, we know this is how we've got to start.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can start with the fact that there are resources now. So when I left the movement, there was nothing there where you could go to get information on how you might help somebody who's involved in hate. Like family members can can get help through these organizations, i.e. Life After Hate. A place that I work for in the United States, and it's I think it's a multi-sectoral approach, though, that I often say in these types of interviews, is that we can look at this from use education to help spread dialogue and word and inclusivity in society, things like this. But then we also have programs for people who are wrapped up in this. I mean, just think about how many people right now are sitting there. Man, I wish I could just get out of this gang, or I wish I could just get out of this hate group. Yeah. I mean, it's important that we have these resources. And work from a bottom-up approach and not so much the top-down.
Thank you very much. Well, look, thank you. I'm so sorry we're out of time. Thank you to all of you for joining us. I'd like to thank all of my guests tonight. From the first segment, we had Shoka Adam, Faiza Muqeet and Amina Sharif. And of course, with us now, Dr. Mariam Mahmood, Hadia Wasir and Brad Galloway. Thank you all so much. Remember, we're dedicating the whole of November's review to the subject of Islamophobia awareness. So thank you so much for joining us again on tonight's show. We look forward to seeing you for the next episode of the review, where we're going to be looking at Islamophobia in the United States of America. From all of us here at Islam Channel, thank you. Assalamu alaikum.